Good morning, everyone. I'm Warwick McKibben, Director of the Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. It's a great pleasure to be here today, particularly to introduce the keynote speaker in this morning's session. Professor Carol Graham is the Leo Pavlovsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. She's also a Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labour. Carol is well known to most people in this room. She's the author of many influential books, including her recent book, Happiness for All, Unequal Lives and Hopes in the Pursuit of the American Dream, which I actually received as a birthday present this year. It's great reading. She's also author of The Pursuit of Happiness, An Economy of Wellbeing. In addition to these widely read books, she's also published in top international journals, including the Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation, Journal of Population Economics, Journal of Socioeconomics, Foreign Affairs, and she has some work in the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. She's also a great public servant. She's an editor of the journals such as Behavioural Science and Policy, and associate editor of the Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation, and she's been on the editorial boards of numerous other journals. She's also served on a National Academy of Sciences panel on Wellbeing Metrics and Policy in 2012-13 and received a Distinguished Research Fellow Award for significant contributions to the field from the International Society of Quality of Life Studies for 2014. I've known Carol for more than 20 years during my other life at Brookings Institution. Carol at the Brookings Institution served as Vice President and Director of Governance Studies from 2002 to 2004. As well, in other parts of Washington, she's had significant impact. She served as a special advisor to the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. She's been a consultant at the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, United Nations Development Programme, and the Harvard Institute for International Development. Carol was born in Lima, Peru. She has an AB from Princeton University, an MA from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a PhD from Oxford University. So Carol is an outstanding guest. This is her first visit to Australia, hopefully not her last visit, and I must say you're all very privileged to have the opportunity to hear what Carol has today. Carol, over to you.
Well, Warwick, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's nice to see the other half of your life here, down under. This is indeed my first time here, and I love it already, so I'm planning on coming back. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me. It's already, I've gotten to know some of the people on the committee, and it's a neat group of economists, and it seems like a great conference. So I'm really pleased to be opening it up. Now, I just want to make sure I have the, okay, perfect. All right, I can work the clicker, so that's a good start. So this is sort of a funny topic and talk for me to be giving, and an odd book for me to write, because as Warwick mentioned, I'm originally from Peru. I spent most of my life working on poverty and inequality, and most recently well-being, the determinants and the consequences of well-being in countries all over the world, but with a real focus on developing economies. But in recent years, I've been coming back to the US and finding that there's something severely wrong, something just unsettled in US society. And I've been focusing a lot on the high cost of being poor in a rich country that focuses on, or that thinks of itself as a meritocracy, even though that isn't really the case anymore. So this is a book on unhappiness in the US and a presentation on that research. But it's also a demonstration of what the kinds of insights that well-being metrics can make in economics. Anytime you take on a new approach, sort of why? What does it contribute that existing approaches don't already contribute? And so I'm going to give you some examples of how the metrics work and what kinds of insights they can contribute that I think complement standard economic measures, and why I hope it will continue to be a burgeoning field in economics. So I set off in this research to tell the story of inequality in the US from the perspective of well-being metrics. And I ended up with a different story. It's certainly inequality is part of the story, but I ended up with a story about big differences in resilience across races, a story of high levels of premature mortality among poor whites, a story of hopelessness among some cohorts and incredible resilience among others. And the other part of the story is a story about place, about how some places are incredibly desperate and sort of falling off the map, so to speak, of both, not just economically, but also in terms of community and society, and other places are vibrant and booming along. And so we have a very divided country in the US, and with some pretty awful consequences. So I started off with the concept of the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson's pursuit of happiness. It's in our Declaration of Independence. It's not about guaranteed outcomes, but about opportunities to seek fulfilling lives. And it's grounded in Aristotle and Mill, so it's grounded in the idea of individual freedom, but also some sort of social justice and social fairness. Looking at the US, I basically asked, okay, the US is more unequal than it's been by any number of measures, most of them inequality and opportunity measures, but is this American dream, the right to the pursuit of happiness, also unequally shared? And indeed, my research explores why, not just the increasingly unequal distributions of income, but also unequal distributions of well-being and beliefs in future opportunity matter today and in the future. And I think a stark wake-up call for all of us was the 2016 election and the kinds of sentiments and divisions that have surfaced since then. But an even starker marker is the rise of increase in premature mortality rates in the US. So we're the only rich country in the world where the mortality rate is going up, and it's being driven by preventable deaths among middle-aged, uneducated whites. Not only, but primarily. So as Warwick mentioned, some of this is in my new book, Happiness for All, Unequal Hopes and Lives in Pursuit of the American Dream, but then also some of the latest work we've been doing on mortality is more recent. So let me just say a little bit about how we measure well-being, the metrics. It's important that people know that we're not just running around asking people if they're happy or something makes them happy, right? So it started off as a nascent collaboration between a few lonely economists and psychologists. I was one of them. A few others were Danny Kahneman, Andrew Oswald, Richard Easterlin, but we were seen as totally nuts. You work on what? Happiness? I remember I wrote a book on happiness in 2002, and the then director of economic studies, who Warwick knows well, Bob Lighton, said to me, "This is a really good manuscript, but you've got to take happiness out of the title because nobody's going to take you seriously." I didn't take happiness out of the title. I didn't sell many books. But the next one, 9 years later, was a little bit different, or 7 years later. A lot of things happened. More and more economists started using these metrics. Danny Kahneman was the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics, and that shook things up a little bit. And then increasingly, not just in academic research, but also governments, the OECD, the British government, got really interested in using these metrics. And so we had been this kind of outlier band of crazy economists and ended up very involved in policy debates and trying to develop these metrics in a way that they can be used in statistics offices around the world in a comparable, robust way. So it's really exploded from an outlier field to being at least relatively mainstream in economics, but also in many other social sciences. And it's become a very interdisciplinary study of well-being in general. We can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting time on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier, and why the unemployed are less unhappy with higher local unemployment rates. None of those things make sense from standard economic perspectives, right? You're supposed to be consuming cigarettes because it's a choice, a revealed preference in a budget constraint, and you're willing to sacrifice everything else because you want to smoke cigarettes. So why are smokers less happy than non-smokers? The unemployment rate, right? If you're unemployed, you're predicting the probability that you'll be unemployed, according to standard economics. And so if there's a higher local unemployment rate, that should make you unhappy. But it turns out that if you're unemployed and there are more unemployed people around you, you feel less stigmatized. You know, it's not just you. And so there are lots of things that these metrics tell us that standard approaches don't reveal. So I focus on two areas. Situations where individuals don't have the agency to make choices, and or consumption decisions that are not the result of optimal choices at all. So take, for example, the macro and institutional arrangements that individuals can't change, like inequality. It's very hard to reveal your preference if you live in a very unequal society, short of emigrating or protesting, how you feel about inequality. But well-being metrics can assess whether inequality makes people more or less well off in terms of well-being. And then behaviors that are driven by imposed norms, addiction, or self-control problems. I like to think of, say, the example of somebody in a lower caste in a very poor part of India who doesn't send their child to school. Is that really a revealed preference, or is that something that's the result of a strongly imposed norm that may have negative welfare consequences? But there are lots of other reasons why, if the schools are bad and your expectations that you'll always be in a lower caste, and there are expenses associated with the school cost as well, that very poor people may not really choose not to send their kid to school. It's just a result of a norm, and a situation in which they don't have agency. So back to this particular topic, which is the well-being effects of inequality in the U.S., it's important, and also the approach, it's important to be a little more clear about the metrics. When we started doing this, we didn't really know what we were doing. There were happiness questions in international surveys, and that's what we used. But over time, and I think economists learning a lot from psychologists have gotten much more clear about the terminology and the dimensions of well-being that we're measuring. So happiness, well-being, subjective well-being, and life satisfaction are often used interchangeably, but they're actually distinct concepts and distinct parts of well-being. So happiness attracts the most attention. It's the least well-defined term because it can be happiness yesterday or it can be happiness in general. Actually, increasingly in research, we're trying to avoid the term happiness. It's in the title of my books because that sells books, but in terms of the actual empirical research, it's not a very well-defined term. It tends to get a lot of media attention and often misguided attention because everybody thinks it's about how to be happy. You know, you're working on telling me how to be happy, which is not what we're doing at all. So what we do is we measure 3 dimensions of well-being distinctly. One is hedonic well-being. So these are measures of how people experience their daily life. Are they smiling or happy as they go through their activities, positive affect, positive moods, or are they stressed? Are they angry? Are they having negative affect and negative moods? And this is a way to measure quality of life on a daily basis. I call this the Benthamite kind of well-being. It's how content or not you are on a daily basis. Life satisfaction or evaluative well-being is a separate, although related dimension of well-being, which is how people evaluate their life circumstances as a whole. Generally speaking, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? When people are asked that question, they think about their life as a whole. If they're older, they look back. If they're younger, they look ahead. Not surprisingly, life satisfaction answers are more correlated with income than are the hedonic metrics, because after a certain point, more money won't make your commute better, it won't make you smile more in the day, it won't make you enjoy your time with your friends more or less. But more money does give you more options to choose the life that you want to lead. And so you get different, income matters more to life satisfaction than hedonic well-being. It doesn't mean that more and more income buys more and more life satisfaction, but they are correlated. And then lastly, a new dimension that we're starting to measure explicitly is what I call the Aristotelian dimension of well-being, and that's eudaimonic well-being, and basically whether people have purpose and meaning in their lives. In fact, the Brits have this in their, the ONS in Britain has 4 questions on well-being in their national surveys. They have 2 experienced questions, then they have life satisfaction, and then they have a eudaimonic question explicitly. So it's the area we probably know least about, and I would argue it's probably the most important, but that's open for question. Okay, so probably people don't want to look at equations in a 9 a.m. address, but there's a reason for this. This is how we measure this. And again, the most important thing to take away from this, which is pretty easy for economists to grasp, but often non-economist audiences don't use equations as often, so they may not get this as easily. But what we do is we take whatever dimension of well-being we're measuring. So it could be life satisfaction, it could be stress yesterday, it could be angry yesterday. That's the individualized. That's the left hand. equation. And then we control for a whole host of demographic and socioeconomic traits. And then we have unobserved traits in the error term. And the thing about the error term in this equation is it's actually quite important because there's a lot about individual well-being that's innate that we can't explain, we can't observe, right? So there's what we can't explain often is capturing innate character traits, natural cheerfulness, high levels of well-being. And we've actually, over time, started to use that information and be able to look at where people are in terms of this distribution of what we call residual well-being and see if people with higher levels of well-being perform differently or respond to negative shocks differently. Are they more resilient? The answer to all of those questions are yes. But in any event, so that's what we do, and what we find is remarkably consistent patterns in the determinants of well-being around the world. So income does matter, right? It's not the only thing, but everywhere we've studied well-being, people who are destitute have lower levels of well-being than people that have sufficient means. Age matters. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Health matters. It tends to matter more than income. Employment matters. People who are unemployed are significantly less happy than employed people almost everywhere we've studied this. Social relationships matter. Friendships correlate with well-being, and also marriage. Those last two things you have to be careful with because if you're looking at a cross-section, there's marriage, for example, is an artifact of construction, which is a funny way to talk about marriage. But what you're picking up is that happier people are more likely to marry each other, right? So if you look over time, the over time effects of marriage on well-being are about 18 months. And then people return back to their natural level of happiness, right? So I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but that's the over time thing, because in these cross sections, you're just picking up that happier people tend to marry each other, right? And less happy people are less likely to get married. In fact, I have a colleague in France, Claudia Seneck, that wrote a great paper called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife." And it turns out, she has overtime data, and it turns out that the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So it's much better to have two happy people married to each other or two miserable people married to each other. But you don't want a very happy and a very unhappy person married to each other because they drive each other crazy. Anyway, but just the whole point there is just to be careful. Again, this is when these findings often get misconstrued in the media, and they'll say, see, marriage makes you happier, and it's actually not anything to do with that. But I mean, it might for some people, but that's not what these data show, the way they're constructed. So another thing that is remarkably consistent, I mean, one thing that's important about these consistencies is that because these patterns in these key variables are so consistent across people over time in hundreds of countries around the world. We have 162 countries in the world in the Gallup World Poll, and these patterns hold in almost every one of them. So what's important about the consistencies is that then we can look at the well-being effects of things that vary. That could be inequality, inflation or unemployment rates, environmental quality, personal behaviors such as smoking or exercising, commuting time, and more, because we can control for the things that we know hold consistently. So now this next slide will make you happy or unhappy depending where you are. Or you should be happy given your last birthday. So what we find, this is a relationship between happiness and age, and it holds around the world. And this is controlling for health and being in a stable partnership. It's age-adjusted health. We don't expect a 75-year-old to be as healthy as a 25-year-old. But what we get is there's a U-shaped curve in the middle-aged years, so-called midlife crisis. And this varies a little bit by where we do this. This is data from Latin America. The bottom of their curve is about 47. I'm from Peru, so I'm definitely on my way up. The U.S. and Europe, Australia, about 44. Then other countries where it's not as good to age, where conditions are worse, like Russia, it turns much later. So in Russia, the bottom of the U is about 60, which is roughly life expectancy for males. You can draw your own conclusions about what's going on with the females. So what explains this? A lot of different things. One is just the middle-aged years, right? The people have double burdens, often teenage children, aging parents. The other is an aspirations aligning with reality effect. you know, if by the time you're 44 and you can't sing and play guitar, you probably should give up on being a rock star, right? I mean, people sort of figure out what they're going to be when they grow up by the mid-40s, and that can be a rude awakening, and then things get better. There's also kind of a selection bias, because happier people live longer, and so as you get to this top, the least happy people are dying off. And then
Microphone, please.
do I have a
I have got a roaming one, sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just try and stay put, which is difficult for me. But anyway, the other thing, psychologists talk about sort of more emotional stability as people age. So younger people have more emotional swings, and older people have less of them. In economics terms, and as the mother of 3 teenagers, I describe it as younger people have a higher standard deviation of bad experiences, right? They haven't had as many bad experiences, so every bad experience is the end of the world. By the time you get to that, you know, going up that curve, you've had so many bad experiences, they just roll off your back. Just 2 other quick things on this curve. One is that we also find that people with higher levels of innate well-being, so naturally happier people, turn earlier. They also live longer, so they tend to have more happy life years, as do people who live in generally happy countries with better living, better styles of living. So
This may make you happy.
thank you. That does help. Okay, good. I can walk around. So there's kind of a there is no justice sort of thing, where happier people get more happy life years, and people in happier countries, which are usually associated with better quality of life, also tend to have more happy life years. They both live longer, and there are more happy people there. The other thing is that this is not just a curve for humans. A colleague of mine, Andrew Oswald, in Britain, did a study of cheerfulness in apes. I kid you not. It was published in Science, and they found that orangutans have an increase in cheerfulness, measures of how they express cheerfulness, in their, that is at the lowest point in the middle age years for orangutans. So there's something biological going on here, which is, I think, I don't know, I don't think it was Australia. But anyway, so that's kind of also what's interesting about well-being, is that there's some combination of genetics and biology and then environmental traits. And the last point of this U is to say what's going on in the US right now is that a lot of people, primarily blue-collar whites, are not coming out of that U. They're not living long enough to get to these happier years due to preventable deaths, opioids, suicide, a lot of desperation and unhappiness. So to the U.S., I think I wanted to say enough about the metrics, talk about what they can contribute. So one of the things when thinking about these 2 kinds of well-being is that the daily experience kind of well-being is an important dimension of well-being, but it's very limited. If you only think in the day, you're not thinking about your future, you're not investing in your future. And we find that people with more positive attitudes about the future, who are able to conceive of their futures and have hope for their futures, they tend to be happier, they tend to invest more in those futures, and they tend to have better futures, right? They're more likely to invest in their health and their education. They're usually also more able because they have more agency. People with more limited future opportunities and lower levels of well-being have higher discount rates, right? They have less capacity to make investments in the future because they have less liquidity and less agency, but they're also less confident they'll pay off. So they tend to focus on daily experiences. They lack the capacity to plan ahead. Life is stressful. It's driven by circumstances beyond control. So this is what I call bad stress. It's the kind of stress that very poor people have, where if their car breaks down, they lose their job, and that gets into a negative cycle. Or if a child is very sick, the family's thrown into poverty. And there's this constant daily struggle just to stay alive. So people with that kind of stress and that kind of future outlook may report to enjoy daily experiences because they're human, and they should. But you'll find that they score much lower on life fulfillment or life satisfaction questions. Versus people who have more capabilities and opportunities may focus more on the longer-term dimensions of their lives, even at the expense of daily quality of life. Think about being in grad school, trying to write a really good dissertation. You often make a sacrifice in terms of your daily life for your future, and there are many other examples of how that works. But people are investing in their futures and, in a way, in their long-term life fulfillment and well-being. So what we find in the US is really a story of two Americas, and it splits along these capacities to have a future, to think about the future, to be hopeful, versus to just live in the day, live in the moment, and struggle. So as late as 2001, Americans were remarkably unbothered by inequality, which always puzzled me because we've had some of the highest levels of inequality of any country in the world for quite a while, and it's increased dramatically. In 2001, some colleagues of mine, Alberto Alesina and Rafael Di Tella, wrote a paper on the well-being effects or happiness effects of inequality, comparing the US and Europe. In Europe, they found some pretty intuitive findings. There was a mild or a modest negative effect of inequality on well-being, and that effect was strongest for the poor. Makes sense, right? If you're at the bottom, inequality would probably bother you more. In the US, the only group that was made unhappy by inequality were left-leaning rich people. Go figure. And one could argue that at some level, if you just talk about inequality per se, you'd probably still get that finding. But there is now much more a sense of perceived injustice in the US and a lot of desperation. So now in 2016, 2017, 62% of Americans think their children will be worse off than they are, which is pretty remarkable. Only 33 think their children will live better than they do. It compares to some countries in the OECD, like Portugal and Spain, but this is the US. This is a land of opportunity and this, great faith in the American dream. And if you look at Latin America, for example, only 13% of Chileans think their children will be worse off than they are. So the numbers are almost flipped. Then another way of thinking about this is just what are the words that different cohorts in the US thought? And there's this study that David Leonhardt of the New York Times did that I think is incredibly telling. They did a Google word search of the words that were common. There were words that were common across everywhere, but the words that were common in difficult places to live, and then the words that were common in easy places to live. So for difficult places to live, think Detroit, bad parts of Baltimore, Duluth, places in the heartland that are hollowed out. For the good places, think Portland, Boston, Washington, D.C., the nice parts of Washington, D.C., although most of it's getting nice now. But just, sort of the prosperous, economically vibrant areas. So what they found is that the common words in poor America are guns, religion, hell, stress, diabetes, video games, and fad diets. Not a pretty picture, but it's also living at the moment, patched together solutions, right? The common words in rich America are iPads, foam rollers, baby joggers, baby Bjorns, and exotic travel destinations like Machu Picchu, and also cameras. So, investing in your knowledge, investing in your health, investing in your children's knowledge, and broadening your horizons. Very different worlds, just as told by common words, just daily discussion in these people's lives. So digging deeper into this, I use data. I'm an advisor to the Gallup polls, so we generate data in the Gallup World Poll for 162 countries around the world, 1,000 respondents per country, with more in the bigger countries from 2005 until now. So we have a huge world data set. And then we have the Gallup Healthways Survey, which it's a U.S. survey that started in 2008, but that interviews 1,000 Americans a day. It's nationally representative sample via telephone polls, but so it's a huge number of respondents across the U.S. Obviously not the same respondents every day. And then I started by comparing attitudes about the future, hard work, just well-being trends in the U.S. and Latin America, which is a region that's culturally quite similar, but has long been known for high levels of inequality and poverty, and wanted to know what I would find. Then within the U.S., I explored how trends in well-being and ill-being vary across socioeconomic cohorts and races and places. And then lastly, the last bit of work I'll show you, we've been matching our well-being and ill-being data with the CDC data on premature mortality rate to see if the data match and if the well-being indicators or ill-being indicators can be good markers of things like rising rates of mortality. So first of all, this is experience stress yesterday. It's a very simple question. Did you experience stress frequently yesterday, yes or no? It's a question that was designed by Danny Kahneman. All of these yes or no questions in the Gallup polls are. And he won the Nobel Prize for this detailed experience sampling. And he basically says these yes or no yesterday questions match very closely with his highly technical detailed matching, so that if you want to use a big survey, these questions are pretty on the mark. So as you can see here, this is the poorest quintile is on the left, and then up to the richest, and then the scores on a 0 to 1 scale. People in the U.S. experience much more stress on a daily basis than people in Latin America. But what's relevant about this slide and the next one to come is that the gaps between the scores of the poor and the rich in the U.S. are much bigger than the gaps between the scores of the poor and the rich in Latin America. Right? So, and stress is a marker of ill-being and often of poor health and lots of other things. So here's a question about, did you smile frequently yesterday, yes or no? It's a measure of positive affect, cheerfulness. So as you can see, Latin Americans smile more on a daily basis than people in the US. But again, what you see is this big difference between rich and poor. So the gap between the rich and the poor in the U.S. is almost twice the gap between the rich and the poor in Latin America. So the poor in the U.S. are highly stressed. They're not very happy. They're not very cheerful. What about, this is a finding that really struck me. This is a question of if someone in this country works hard, can they get ahead, yes or no? And this is classic American dream question. This is the U.S. is supposed to be a society where everybody believes that if you work hard, you can get ahead. It's a meritocracy. Well, look at this. The gap in the scores between the rich and the poor in the U.S. and the gap in are 20 times as great, or is 20 times as great as the gap in the scores between the rich and the poor in Latin America. So in Latin America, actually, we did this in a regression framework, and this isn't a great table, but basically, income matters to how people answer this question in the U.S., and it doesn't matter at all in Latin America. So the poor in Latin America are significantly more likely than the poor in the U.S. to believe hard work will get them ahead, versus the rich in the U.S. are more likely to believe hard work will get them ahead than the rich in Latin America. Many reasons for this. One of them is something called learner's just beliefs hypothesis, which is if you get ahead, you want to believe you got ahead in a just society, right? You don't want to believe you got ahead in an unjust society where you had lots of unfair advantages. There's some mix between people who got ahead often did work very hard. They probably had some advantages. But clearly there are very divided beliefs on the American dream in the US, and much more than in Latin America, which is, until recently, really was a region known for low levels of mobility, high levels of inequality, and high levels of poverty. Even though they've been making a lot of progress. So once I found this, I wanted to know more about what's going on in the US. Oh, one more thing on this stress question, and don't worry about the numbers because it's not a great slide to see, but one of the things is I was trying to tease out this, does this play out empirically, the fact that the poor experience bad stress and the rich experience good stress, right? Bad stress is associated with circumstances beyond your control. Good stress is associated with goal achievement. So good stress may produce unhappiness in the short term, but it's got sort of better longer term purposes. So indeed we find in this slide when we, stress has a, I don't know if there's a, there's not a, like a, oh, that's all right. So stress is terrible for well-being. If you look down here, experienced stress yesterday, yes or no, is about 5 down, and it's the negative coefficient of 0.89, which is almost 4 times greater than the positive coefficient on income, right? So stress is really bad for well-being. But when we interact stress with income and or with education, we find that that mitigates. So if you're stressed but you have more income, or you're stressed but you have more education, that mitigates the negative effect of stress significantly. Basically, it's a lot better to have stress if you're rich than if you're poor. So looking across the US, one of the things I'm convinced about with the study of inequality is that when we look at aggregate levels of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, well, nobody knows what the Gini coefficient in their country is, nor do they care. Inequality matters to people at a smaller level of aggregation in your firm, in your neighborhood, at least in a geographic area where you connect with people and you can see it. Is inequality visible? So we looked across metropolitan statistical areas in the US. These are bigger than zip codes and smaller than US states. And we found, this is a simple scatter plot, but we did this in a regression framework and got even stronger findings, that in local areas with higher levels of inequality, the poor experience more stress on a daily basis than the poor in areas with less inequality. And that does not hold for the rich. There's not the same effect for the rich. We also looked at reported social support. And one of the things is, it's a question that says, do you have friends or family you can rely on at times of need, right? It's sort of informal safety nets. The US has a particularly bad system of formal safety nets. So informal safety nets matter a lot. The poor report to have less social support in places that have higher levels of inequality, local levels. And so do the rich, actually. So the rich report to have higher levels of social support, but in places with more inequality, they have less of it. So again, inequality is showing that there's something much more divided about more unequal places in the US. So once I found these findings comparing the poor and the rich in the US and the poor and the rich in Latin America, and then some of these findings on the manifestations of inequality on the reported well-being, particularly of the poor across local areas, I wanted to know more about differences across races and places, right? So when I started this, it was a time of the Baltimore riots and the Ferguson riots in the US. So there was a lot of concern about the African American community being a mess. Donald Trump was way far out there. Nobody believed anything would come of him. And so I looked and I thought, I compared these attitudes about the future, optimism about the future across poor blacks, poor whites, and poor Hispanics. What I thought I'd get was a modestly optimistic coefficient on poor Hispanics, because Hispanics tend to be very optimistic. I'm from Latin America. Latin America always scores higher than its income would predict on all kinds of well-being indicators. I thought I'd get sort of neutral on poor white and very negative on poor black. And instead, I got this. Poor blacks are 3 times as likely to score higher on an optimism scale than poor whites. Poor Hispanics are about 1.25 times as likely to score higher up on an optimism scale. So I got this huge negative coefficient on poor whites. This is before the mortality rate data was evident. This was before the big movement of support for Donald Trump was evident. And I thought I had a coding error. Maybe this was the data. And I checked it again and again. And then Ann Case and Angus Deaton released their study showing, the CDC data showing rising rates of suicide, opioid poisoning, and other things driving premature mortality rates among uneducated whites. And these findings, our findings basically complemented each other. We also find that this is stress, and poor blacks are half as likely to experience stress on a daily basis than are poor whites. Hispanics about 2/3 as likely. And you have to remember, these are minorities who've been and still are traditionally discriminated against, that are materially worse off. They've been catching up slowly, but they're much more optimistic, much less desperate. And in fact, if you look at the age component of this, the gaps between blacks and whites are at their biggest exactly in the middle-aged years, where desperate whites are committing suicide. And we find that as blacks age, they actually get more optimistic about the future and report higher levels of life satisfaction versus uneducated whites, we're comparing poor cohorts now. Poor whites get angrier and less happy as they age. So the gap between them attenuates if you look over the age curve. Back to how we got to this, this is sort of a monster equation. But what we did basically is we're trying to interact income and race cohorts. So again, we had the particular well-being or ill-being marker for individual I and MSA J for time t. And then we looked at life satisfaction today, expected life satisfaction in 5 years, which is a proxy for optimism, experienced stress yesterday, worry yesterday, city satisfaction. We also looked at social support network, and in some specifications where we had the data, we also looked at anger yesterday. Then we control for all sorts of socio-demographic things from income, well, we're using income, but from health to gender, education, employment status, experience pain the previous day. And pain's an important variable because pain tends to be, at least in the US, a gateway to suicide. High levels of reported pain are often then linked to high usage of opioids, overprescribed and or illegal, and then are a gateway to suicide. Health problems, religious preference, marital status, lack of money for food or health care, basically everything we could do. And then in an additional specification, we included the composite measure from the CDC, which includes suicide, liver disease, accidental poisoning, and indeterminate deaths for 35 to 64-year-olds. So again, first of all, the starkest finding is just that poor blacks and poor Hispanics are so much more optimistic and significantly less stressed than poor whites. But then when we add in the suicide data at the MSA level, we find that basically the question I was asking here is, does lack of hope matter? Do high levels of stress matter? Do they correlate with these high levels of premature death? And the answer is very strongly yes. We find that basically the MSA level this kind of mortality, this composite death rate, is negatively correlated with life satisfaction and future life satisfaction at the individual level, and positively correlated with stress and worry. So we don't know the direction of causality here. We just don't have enough data on the same people over time, particularly if they're committing suicide. But at least there's a strong association, and I think the causality is a two-way causality. So if you're an individual where everybody around you has no hope for the future and is sort of desperate and worried, you know, it's probably not good for your outlook and your future, versus the other side of it is being very desperate. It seems to be linked to higher propensity to commit suicide. We also looked at the aggregate level, at the level of place. So is there something about different MSAs, different places that are more desperate than others? If you look at a map of the suicide deaths, they're very strongly concentrated in the heartland of the US, Appalachia, some of the Midwestern states. So there's a regional component to this premature death rate. So I've been trying to understand what is it about these places. So we find that at the aggregate level, we find that percent of smokers per MSA, so that's a health behavior, we're looking at health behaviors as well as place. Percent of smokers is negatively correlated with life satisfaction and positively correlated with stress. Not surprising, but you know, to see it play out locationally is important. Percent of respondents who exercise is positively correlated with future life satisfaction, current and future, negatively correlated with stress. We also found that racial diversity as a characteristic of place was also positively correlated with future life satisfaction and also negatively correlated with stress. So these the places with these same traits that have better health behaviors or more racially diverse, they're also more economically vibrant. They tend to be coastal, not exclusively, but they're usually not in the heartland, and they have significantly lower mortality rates. So there's sort of an individual level story of how ill-being and lack of hope correlates with higher levels of mortality, but there's also an aggregate story of place and economies and societies that differ very much between the heartland of the US, where basically the white working class is dying out, and the coast. So this really is still work in progress, but I think it's clear from so many aspects of the data, ranging from the words that people use to health outcomes to markers of stress and hope and worry and anger, that the U.S. is very divided in terms of being two Americas. There are individuals that have high levels of well-being and better future outcomes, and then they have greater capacity to control their lives. Some of this is intrinsic, but some of it is very much where you happen to be born in a very unequal income distribution. In wealthy America, people have high levels of life satisfaction and high ability to plan for the future and invest in it. In poor America, you have low life satisfaction, high levels of stress and other markers of ill-being, and increasingly high rates of suicide and other premature death, but very big differences across races and places. Why are minorities more resilient? This is a big question. I'm trying to explore it. One may be simply that they've had many, many years of negative shocks and have adapted and are more resilient in the same way that you find often with poor people in countries around the world. Another part is that they are indeed making gradual progress. So it used to be that education gaps were the biggest between blacks and whites. And now education gaps are determined much more by where you are in the income distribution than what your race is. Marriage rates are the same. It used to be that the big marker of single-headed households was being black, and now the biggest marker of single-headed households is being poor. So the stable blue-collar white middle-class family is rapidly disappearing, and there's many single-headed households among poor whites than among poor minorities. There's also an expectations thing. So most minorities report to live better than their parents did. In contrast, most blue-collar whites report to live worse than their parents did, right? So these are typically people who were either in manufacturing, coal mining, other kinds of blue-collar careers in usually rural areas or suburban areas, and they are indeed doing worse than their parents. They may not be doing worse in terms of absolute income, but they're doing worse in terms of job security, job status. Even, the existence of those jobs are largely under threat. Minorities are also much more resilient. There are a lot of low-skilled jobs, for example, in the health sector, which blacks and minorities will take, including black and Hispanic men, but poor, unskilled white working-class men won't take those jobs. There's a projection now that by 2050, 25% of the prime age male labor force in the United States is just going to be out of the workforce. Right now, I think it's 15%. And there's a big white, blue-collar component to that. And that very strongly links with the suicide rates. So part of this story is really about the decline of the white working class. Another part is differences in community structures, family structure, informal safety nets. One of the things we also find is that minorities, maybe because they've had to cope more again, have stronger informal safety nets. It could be the role that churches play in a lot of black life. It could be the role that families play in a lot of Hispanic life. There's something more to it, and this is something I'm trying to understand better. Versus if you have these manufacturing towns where the firm was sort of it, whether it was the coal mine or the car plant, that's where people... There were sort of the more stable white working class family, and then these, whatever the main employer was that provided most of whatever the town was, and that's gone. And you just see communities that are completely hollowed out. And it doesn't mean that minorities in the U.S. don't deserve a great deal of attention. They still face a lot of disadvantage. But we do have a crisis of social ill-being of proportions that is really remarkable. Some of this is not unique to the U.S. A lot of European countries and possibly Australia are facing similar challenges from globalization. It's technology-driven growth, right? The number of available blue-collar jobs is not going to go up. It's going to go down. And so depending on the nature of how likely it is people can switch jobs, there is a backlash. Brexit was the composite of the electorate that supported Brexit was very similar as the composite of the election that supported Trump. So there's some similarities. But some other things are unique to the US. One is this exceptionally high levels of inequality, and also this persistent, we're a meritocracy, if you're on social support, you're a loser mentality that particularly is come out more strongly in the Republican verbiage. And what's interesting is that the same voters that voted for Trump, the same voters that are at risk of losing blue-collar jobs where the mortality rates are highest, are saying things like, get the government out of my Medicare. Or, they didn't know Obamacare was the ACA Act, and they're going, what? I'm going to lose my health insurance now? But there's this very prevalent, difficult to understand anti-government sentiment among these same people who desperately need retraining, relocation, better education. So it's a real conundrum in terms of how you deal with this. And then there are just some things that we also just have a really limited welfare support system that stigmatizes the poor. In addition to the verbiage, the actual bureaucracies do. So we as a society, we being the US, are really ill-equipped to deal with this. And the political dynamics are really, really unhelpful, to say the least, at the moment. So we have a really severe social crisis, and it's not, I think there are all sorts of policy recommendations in my book and on the table in informed discussions, but they're nowhere near the political framework right now. And then just the last point is, if we had been tracking well-being in our official metrics as they are in Britain and some other countries, we could have caught this well before mortality rates went up. If it weren't just me sitting in my Brookings office, which is a very nice place to be, but if this were kind of a more consistent measurement activity, and we'd seen this surprising levels of desperation among poor whites, which existed at least 10 years ago. They're not new. They've been there for a while. It might have woken us up before a mortality rate went up. So that is an example of where the measurement science and these new metrics tell us things that standard economic data don't tell us. And right now they're telling us something very important that is, that's destroying the fabric of our society, which I think we could have been aware of it long before had we been tracking well-being. So with that rather optimistic picture, maybe that's why I'm so happy to be in Australia right now, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Carol. Oh, okay, so we will give this back. Is that correct? Yes. Thanks, Carol. That was not a very happy note to end on.
Sorry.
But I will ask the first couple of questions, or at least one question, if that's okay. You didn't really touch on what do we do, what are the policy implications, because you've been measuring a lot of this, and that draws out, it's pretty stark outcome for the US and other parts of the world because of technology and globalization. What do you think, where are the answers? Is it a minimum basic income? Is it a restructuring of the systems that we've developed in the 21st century? Do you have any insights on this, or is it just too early?
Well, it's a great question. And indeed, I've thought a lot about this. Now, my insights and their probability of being implemented anytime soon are very different things, because we're also in a very stalled, toxic political environment. But there are a number of things. One is just the U.S. public education system in particular is as divided as opportunities and income and everything else is. So depending on where you live, your public school is good or bad. Your odds of going to college are good or bad. So a big revamping of public education. But that's also going to require community level work, because if you are living in one of these hollowed out blue collar areas where the tradition was, the dad was a coal miner or a car factory worker, and you went to high school and then you went to work, so there isn't a tradition of people going to college. There's deep desperation. There's no hope for the future. You need something to motivate kids to get, this is going to get you out of this. Because without a college education in today's economy, it's really hard to go anywhere. For older people, it's too late to retrain, it's too late to relocate. You're not going to if you were a retired coal miner in Appalachia, you're not going to work in Silicon Valley. People say that people move less in the U.S. these days, and that's indeed true, in part because of housing foreclosures. but also it's because of the skills division, right? So you're just in the vibrant parts of the economy. A lot of these same, particularly older workers, are not going to get work. So we need to think about community level sort of revitalization. The well-being metrics tell us a lot about the benefits of volunteering, about all sorts of things that can be done. And there's some examples now of one very poor city in West Virginia, between the mayor's office and industry, and also did a revitalization of infrastructure and other things that also included employment and volunteer so there's that. There is the issue of what vocational tracks are still relevant in today's economy, because not everybody can go to college, and there may be some of those tracks that are ways that that some of the younger generation could retrain and tool up. Our safety net is awful. I mean, we give people food stamps, or the one program that works very well in the U.S. is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. So if you're working poor, it's great. You just get a check in the mail once a year. It's not stigmatizing. It works beautifully like Social Security or Medicare, the universal programs do. But the problem we have right now is workers out of the labor force, and an increasing percent. And the programs that are available to them are either A, disability insurance, which is a lifelong safety net, but then you're not allowed to work. So it's mired in sort of you're going nowhere. Or cash assistance for needy families, which has been shrinking by state, and the most in the Republican states, yet again. And then food stamps, which are useless. So I think we need to revamp our safety net. I've thought a lot about the example that Latin American countries use, which is conditional cash transfer programs, and they give the poor non-marginal amounts of income that are really useful, conditional on them sending their kids to school and taking them to the health post. So it's pulling them in. As they don't stigmatize them, but they're contingent on them making productive investments, right, in the next generation. Just the change in mindset, I think, that a different kind of safety net can do. And there's so much more. There are other things. There even these same places with high mortality rates, hollowed out industries in the heartland, are less likely to have broadband internet. Their kids are more likely to grow up in civic deserts, meaning there are no political organizations and no other kinds of civic organizations. So there's a lot of sort of thinking to be done about what can we do at community levels, and which communities actually should just die and people should leave. I mean, so there's some tough choices there too.
So I'm seeing a few hands. Just I had one other question, given I'm the chair, I can take my prerogative. It's a very rich data set. You said there's 160 countries. It seems that when you were comparing the US, you're looking at other countries that were similar to the US, like you've seen the same factors in Europe. What about countries that are totally different, where there's been the same global pressures, but there's been some either institutional or market or some other response which has led to a much better outcome? Is there a project to look at the success stories outside the US, or is it still comparing success and failure within the US?
At the moment, I'm sort of mired in CDC data and trying to really get this matching story right, and also to understand place better. What is it about some places and populations that do better than others? But certainly, yeah, there are countries that have better retraining or safety net programs or public education programs that have done better. Australia doesn't seem to have, I don't know enough about it, I haven't looked closely at the data, but the same kind of challenges in terms of, just deep social desperation. I've also looked a little bit at attitudes in East Asia, like China. I compared China, Korea, Japan on this hard work question, just to get a sense of how that distribution was. And so Japan also has a division between the rich and the poor, but it's not as big as the US. Korea has an interesting flip, which is the poor are more likely to believe hard work will get them ahead than the rich. And then the developing countries, like Vietnam or whatever, look a little bit more like Latin America, but not as optimistic as Latin Americans. There's also the, Branko Milanovic's elephant chart. So there's a colleague of both of ours who's expert on global ineconomy, and he describes global ineconomy in the shape of an elephant, where the big hump, is the middle classes in the middle income growing countries, which are growing, and then the kind of down part of the tusk are the middle classes in advanced economies, and the up part of the tusk are the wealthy people in wealthy countries. So at the same time that middle classes in some very wealthy countries are being threatened, middle classes are burgeoning in the poorer countries, or in the middle-income developing countries.
Okay, we've got plenty of time for questions. Could you put up your hand? The microphone is the first one at the back here. The microphone will come to you. Please say who you are and what your affiliation is, and address your question directly to Carol. And I'll just collect hands.
My name's Shan Turnbull. I was at the OECD workshop on wellbeing in February, and my question is, do you believe that metrics of well-being should be developed to replace or augment GDP figures? And what is your assessment of the 11 metrics of well-being that the OECD are now developing?
Well, I was pretty involved with the statistics team at the OECD when we were in the National Academies panel, because we were trying to coordinate best practices across all these efforts. So I think that's a really high quality effort for sure. I certainly don't think well-being metrics should replace income metrics. I don't believe in things like gross national happiness at all. I think that these metrics are most useful when they complement standard income-based measures, and when they tell us different things. There's something in those gaps, right? In the different things that both metrics are telling us, that's really important information. But it doesn't mean that, one replaces the other by any means. I also think there's some questions that are better answered by well-being metrics and income-based metrics, and there are other questions better answered by income-based metrics than well-being metrics.
Fells?
Alan Fells, Melbourne Uni. The question of happiness, to analyse it, you also need to, of course, analyse unhappiness, and that is but a step towards depression. That's one important element of unhappiness, and the data from the ABS in Australia and in many countries show that mental illness is experienced by about 20% of the population each year. So I just wanted to ask whether mental illness factors get into this kind of analysis. And also then, if there would be some further questions somewhat along the lines of your important analysis here. It's very interesting and valuable, this work that you've been doing for many years, but there are also correlations between inequity and inequality and mental illness. And there are also some obvious policy questions, but then I'm giving a plug for the next session. So I just want to ask you where mental illness fits into this.
Right, so what we have in the Gallup is reported depression, self-reported depression. So it's not clinically diagnosed depression. We certainly find that reported depression with this same cohort analysis is higher among the exact same groups that we're talking about, uneducated blue-collar whites, than among minorities. Minorities are much less likely in the U.S. to report depression or commit suicide than are whites in general. I've looked at the other thing, though, that's important in terms of the measurement field, and I'm sure you know this as well, is that you can't treat sort of happiness and depression as different parts of one distribution. They're very different things, although of course on average depressed people are less likely to be happy and happy people are less likely to be depressed, but we're measuring different things. And even with the affect measures, so we can put life satisfaction and smiling on a similar scale. Positive affect is sort of a continuum that can go on to higher levels of life satisfaction, but negative affect is not, it has to be measured separately from positive affect. So you can't, for example, anger and cheerfulness, the same person can experience both the same day, quite a lot, depending on their character traits. But even, we can't sort of say stress is the analog of smiling, right? So I'm pretty careful to try and separate out the negative emotions and feelings and the positive ones. And in terms of the mortality data, we've been looking at them separately, like stress and worry and anger on the one hand, and life satisfaction, hope for the future on the other. But because we don't have a clinical measure of depression, I mean, I have certainly, we've added it into our discussion, but I don't feel confident enough in the measures that we have to say that, well, we can say a lot about depression and mortality in the U.S. Just because that's not those aren't, I don't have I think the correct or the appropriate scientific measures of depression.
Next question here, and then a question here.
Yeah, Ken Oliver from the Commonwealth Department of Social Services. Look, blue-collar white males, not just in the US, but in many developed countries, have been going backwards, at least relatively economically, for a very long time now. We used to agonise about it in the 1970s. Yet it's only now, it seems to me, that at least in the US you get these sort of dreadful social markers of that economic decline, you know, suicide rates, opioid addictions and so on. Do you think that's just because it's chickens coming home to roost, it's an intensification of past trends, if you like, or something's fundamentally changed in the US just in the last 20 years?
That's a really good question, and I think there are a couple of changes. One is the extent of inequality. It really has increased by every metric. If you look at the Gini coefficient in the U.S. from about the 1970s until now, it's changed as much as the Gini coefficient changed when the former Soviet countries turned capitalist, which is a dramatically, society-wrenching change. And so what you have is success being further and further away. So it's sort of the top half of the middle class and the rich moving away from everybody else in terms of the kinds of schools they go to, in terms of the language they use, as I mentioned, in terms of opportunities to go to good colleges, in terms of the affordability of even applying to good colleges. A whole range of things have become further and further away from the average middle class household. There's also been pressure from the bottom up, which is minorities are making serious progress. And despite discrimination, despite other things. And so there's a relative status thing going on for uneducated whites and blue-collar workers in the U.S. right now. And it translates right into this very, anti-government, it's almost voting against their own self-interest thing. The idea that safety nets are for, lazy blacks or whatever the verbiage is, so that these same people they don't have a solution, but they don't want whatever solution is on the table. The other thing is just the nature of, I think, technological change and job displacement has also sped up. And the last thing, which I should have mentioned in my policy response to Warwick, and I forgot, is the way the U.S. dispenses more opioids per capita than any other country in the world. And that had to do with prescription changes and changes in medical attitudes about pain, and the big pharmaceutical companies pushing a lot of opioids. And all of a sudden there's a gradual recognition of that in terms of health practice. But at this point, the genie's out of the bottle, and a lot of people who got addicted to opioids due to desperation and all these other things are now onto all kinds of synthetic heroin. And there's also a drug supply chain issue that's particularly lethal, because it's when people switch from prescription drugs because they run out of money or they run out of their prescription, they go to these illegal versions of heroin like fentanyl, which is linked to really rapid overdose and mortality rates. So that's a whole other part of the problem, and a new factor, and a factor that I think really is much more specific to the U.S. than other societies.
Could I just add to that? Karma and Brookings have an annual conference on the world economy, and our lunch speaker this year was Ben Bernanke. And so I asked Ben to talk about what he thought were the big long-term issues driving the US economy, expecting him to talk about interest rates or something. He focused on the opioid addiction and the effect on long-term economic growth. More people dying from opioid addiction than gun-related violence and car accidents combined. So, I mean, it is a really, really big deal in the US, which Carol's work was already pointing to that, but then the new work that was presented from Princeton at Brookings Panel Economic Activity last year really did make it a public problem. Everyone started to realise.
Yeah, and the other thing that the costs, it's a little bit like when you think about the cost of AIDS in Africa, and there was a lot of estimates about, productivity losses as you were losing so many prime age parents. And in this case, you have a generation of kids growing up who've watched their parents overdose. And we don't have any clue what the implications of that are, but they're not good.
Hello, Carol. Richard Tooth, Director of Superior Research Consulting Group. Carol, I was hoping you could talk about the status of use of wellbeing measures among the economics profession, both in academia and public policy. To what extent are they being adopted in your experience in the US, and if you can comment on other places? Do you find other academics who resist using the use of these measures, or people in public policy resist using these measures? And are we kind of where behavioural economics was some years ago, and it's just going to become a tidal wave, which is going to go through policy?
I think I think that's what's happening, but there are plenty of people who resist them. Larry Summers being quite a prominent one, who's quite antagonistic. But there are people who used to resist this approach, like Angus Deaton, and is now whole hog into it. But I think increasingly in academics, mainstream economics, the American Economic Review, there's usually a paper on happiness almost every issue. So there's also a lot of new work using experiments, experimental approaches, trying to see if people with different levels of well-being, respond differently, do different things. I have some experimental research in Peru, trying to see the extent to which maternal depression, here I do have reported better measures of depression, and or life satisfaction are passed on to their children and their children's outcomes, and then also the extent to which people with naturally higher levels of well-being do better or less risk averse, survive negative shocks better. So there's a lot going on in this whole area. Even some work other than mine on the Hope Channel in poor people's outcomes. So I think it's becoming pretty, and published in AER or Science, wherever it might be. So published in top journals. In terms of the policy field, I think it's chugging along. Not surprisingly, more slowly in the U.S. than other places. In part, I think it's because our statistical system is so complex and so there's so many different surveys that when we were tasked with recommending where should we put well-being metrics in, we recommended a very, cautious bottom-up approach and particular kinds of surveys that were better for the inclusion of particular kinds of well-being metrics. And part of that was the highly divisive political climate. Right away, the minute our panel was formed, the Wall Street Journal wrote us up as an Obama government effort to tell you how to be happy, which of course it wasn't. But so interestingly enough, the metrics have started, the statistical offices were very receptive to the metrics, and they've started popping up all over the place in a lot of our official statistics. Versus in the UK, they're already in there. I'm a part of something called the What Works Wellbeing Network, which is funding experiments at the community and other levels, research on experiments, and drawing out the lessons of what works. Where do the metrics actually contribute to knowledge that is tractable and useful in the policy discussion and policy solutions? And I think that's a really fruitful area. There are many other countries, Canada, there are many academics in Australia that have done the well-being index and whatever, where the approach is just starting to be a standard way of assessing societal well-being and on a slightly different level from GDP. A lot of the Latin American countries as well. The efforts that worry me much more are when countries like the United Arab Emirates or Venezuela create ministries of happiness. Then you have to get really skeptical, and that's a complete misuse of the metrics. But I think if you had asked me 10 years ago to say that what was happening now in this field is real, I wouldn't have believed it, because there was so much skepticism. So. Well, it's interesting. One is that it doesn't get misused and turn into, you know, in other words, the more we use these metrics in policy, I think public education about what they are and what they're not is going to be really important. Otherwise, we'll get back into the how to be happy thing, and I think that could discredit an incredible amount of progress.
Okay, we
Over
have
to me.
1, 2, and 3 at the back.
Hi, I'm Meg Elkins. I'm from RMIT University. I'm interested in all the research that you've got going on. It's much about those middle-class, blue-collar males. What about the blue-collar females in this? And they're not suiciding at the same rates. What's making them more resilient?
They're not more resilient. They're actually women have a lower suicide rate, but it's gone up at an equivalent pace.
So when you say blue-collar workers, this is blue-collar workers across both sexes.
Yeah, there's more concern about male dropout of the labor force. There's more concern about unmarried men. So in the sense that the women tend to hold together the families, they're less likely to get married. They don't want to marry somebody who doesn't have a job. What good does it do them? So it's sort of a change in what do you do with all these men that are out of work and aren't in families in prime age? It just doesn't seem to be.
And it's the same for the women then. Those obviously, there has to be account for women that are single and.
Right. It's not that I'm not concerned about women. I think their suicide rate and opioid rate has gone up.
The same,
so it's uneducated whites in general in the U.S., but there is a particular concern about the kind of prime age males out of the labor force, because also women are better typically at multitasking and having several identities.
And community, I'm assuming, here as well.
A little bit. So, it's sort of ironic that all of a sudden we're most worried about, white males after in a time that we've spent so much time trying to worry about disadvantages among other groups. But again, and I don't want this research, nor do I, when I write at length about it, to suggest that we shouldn't be worried about black women or Native Americans on, there are plenty of other groups that deserve attention and have much more discrimination and challenges to face. But this is a pretty extreme trend. And unfortunately, it's also already had the potential to derail our whole, political functioning to a point that is terrifying. So it for no other reason, that's one reason to focus on it.
I'm Catherine Lowry from the New South Wales Mental Health Commission. First of all, I want to thank you for your really insightful presentation this morning. I'm really interested in how your views are on how we leverage this into our Treasury decision-making across portfolio investments. When you look at how you have presenteeism at work, at the other impacts upon the economy, have you got any thoughts about how you can then translate this into impacts at that level? Thank you.
At the level of?
At how we leverage this information into how treasuries and government make decisions across their portfolios.
Right. That's obviously a big question. Certainly the issue of public health and education is a giant one, particularly in the U.S. where right now the government's trying to erode access to health care for the most vulnerable. So that's sort of down to a basic guttural level. Don't do anything that stupid. But in terms of future allocations, I think there's a big question about what kind of education and retraining or training programs are going to take larger parts of society to a point that they can participate in the high-skill, high-technology economy, and that's got to require proactive investment in not just in education, that's obvious, but also community-level things in terms of even getting companies on board to do apprenticeship kind of programs, other things. I think it's just going to require a much more active approach unless we're going to just see continued sort of half the train going ahead and half the train staying behind. I mean, the other thing I think that as much as in terms of portfolio investment, there's also the whole issue of regulation. So in the U.S. at least, the financial crisis was really the result of lack of regulation of the housing market and lack of regulation of the banking sector, among other things, and the costs were very, huge hit on the working class that was already invulnerable and hasn't recovered, right? And so there's also just how markets work, I think, should perhaps be a little bit more on the minds of, economic officials to the extent that things are, politically viable.
So we have another question back here.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting address to open this conference. And in your empirical analysis, you mainly focus on the differences between black and white in the US, but I can notice that the Asian group experienced the highest level of stress and the lowest level of optimism. So can you explain a little bit about this result? Thank you.
Well, remember, whites are the comparison point. So they're still more optimistic than whites. So I didn't focus as much on the Asian group, in part because it's a much smaller percentage of the population, and in part because typically they are higher performing in terms of education and employment levels and everything else than the other minorities. So it isn't, there may be assimilation issues, there may be cultural differences, but in terms of innate levels of stress, but it's not in general. Of course, there are exceptions. It's not in general an ethnic group that appears to be in other kinds of stress.
Okay, we have a question down here.
Thank you. Jeremy Samet from the Centre for Independent Studies. I just wanted to ask a question about one of your suggested solutions, which is, as I understand it, conditional welfare around parental behaviour towards children, which occurs in Latin America. We have something similar in Australia, at least to the extent that people who are on unemployment benefits have to meet job search requirements. It means they have to be actively looking for work, otherwise they'll be breached and have their welfare penalised. But that is not enforced in many cases. And my understanding of why that is that the philosophy within the welfare sector in general is that poor people are the victims of structural injustice, and therefore it's wrong to victimise and punish them in that way. I could see a conditional welfare policy, such as you suggested, running into the same sort of cultural or ideological barriers. I wondered if you've considered how you might address that, because I imagine the mindset might be similar in the US as well.
I think the mindset in the US is actually the opposite, which is, if you're poor, it's your fault. And it's a mindset, as I said, that's incredibly troubling among uneducated whites who, don't want government support, don't believe in government support. So it's really a difficult issue to get around. I mean, something like the universal basic income would no more cross any sort of political line in the U.S. than I can fly to the moon. It's just not even a reasonable option for discussion. Versus there's so much more consensus in other societies on societal responsibility for those who fall behind.
Thanks. Mark Jennings from Department of Social Services. You mentioned that there were some jobs that that poor white men won't take, and I was just wondering if you had any more thoughts about why that might be. Is that maybe more of a skills thing, or is that more of a attitude or culture? And also, does the same rule apply to women as well? Thanks.
Right, and this whole issue of kind of difference between poor white men and women is not full. I mean, I don't have complete information, but in terms of the jobs, very clearly it's a white men thing. So a lot of them are jobs in the health sector, other kind of service sectors, and I think it's an identity thing. You know, if you came from a generation of coal miners or car factory workers, your identity was almost part of, you know, your occupational identity was part of your identity, and to go work, I don't know, as a nurse's aide in a hospital is just, it just won't do it. I'm not making a judgment about it, but certainly minorities and women are much more likely to take a whole range of jobs.
Hi, I'm Sasan Bakhtiar from Department of Industry. And I have a question. So because you showed that unemployment and low income both basically affect happiness, but aren't they very much correlated? Because unemployed people are people with zero income, very low income. So imagine like somebody with a job that pays $1,000 a year, are they very different from unemployed people? Is there any discrete effect to being unemployed?
No, I think this goes back to the identity thing. So the effect of unemployment is controlling for income. So even in countries that have almost full income replacement, as in the Scandinavian countries, the unemployed are still significantly less happy than the employed, controlling for income. So, yeah, I mean, and certainly people who have low income and a bad job, sort of a bad quality, low-paying job, are going to be less satisfied with their lives than people that have more means and a better job. But there's an additional independent effect of employment that holds across the board.
Question over.
Hi, my name's Honora Campbell from New South Wales Treasury. I was just wondering about, I know you said you'd done some work with the OECD, or were familiar with it, and I know the OECD's done some work on different types of inequality, namely inequality of opportunity, so from the bottom sort of quintile into the middle quintile, and inequality of effort, which is more around the difference between the middle and the top. And basically saying that where there's, it's actually a positive sort of inequality at the top, where there's sort of spurring to become sort of aspirational efforts, and inequality at the bottom, where it's more around, you know, lack of opportunity. Do you think the policy effort, thinking about the universal basic income, should focus more around elevating the bottom into the top, into the middle, sorry?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's sort of fits with, I think, what I'm saying about, in general, about agency or capability, and that people who are sort of at the bottom of the opportunity ladder without the aspiration or the ability to seek opportunities are deprived in a real sense of a whole dimension of well-being, right? They're deprived of fulfilling their lives in the way that other people can. So I think that should be a huge priority. It gets caught up in, or more complicated, particularly when we were talking about like white collar working class, or I mean blue collar working class whites, in that part of the problem there is they had an identity, they had sort of a purpose in life. May not have been, you know, earth shattering, but they were respected car manufacturing workers or coal miners. They had a role in their communities and in their families, and that's gone. And they don't have any other options, really, particularly the older ones, for getting that back. And so, yeah, I think there are two separate things. One is people who just lack the agency and capability and means to seek opportunities because they start off very deprived. And then this is a second issue of downward mobility, right? Of coming from, or starting in a place, or at least where your family started in a place where you had the means and opportunities to generate a middle-class, stable, respected life, and all of a sudden you don't. And so they're separate, and I don't think they're competing priorities, but they are distinct from each other.
Okay, I have one more question. Back.
Troy Barry from the University of Western Australia. Some of your results suggest that there could be an effect of within-race inequality. Have you checked for that, and does that help explain anything?
Sorry, within race?
Within-race inequality driving some of your different happiness outcomes across races.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think the fact that working class whites who used to be in the middle now find themselves at the bottom, and rich whites are so far away from where they are, makes a big difference. And if you look at incomes, certainly the gaps between poor and rich blacks are big, but if you look at assets, they're much less big across blacks than they are across whites. There's still a lot of inequality in access to assets between blacks and whites, which narrows the differential between poor blacks and rich blacks. There's still more a tradition of pulling up the poor members of the family, which narrows that gap in a slightly different way. And so, yeah, I think there's a cross races in the sense that, well, you're being caught up with by minorities, and then there's a within races in that I think that the gaps between poor uneducated whites and their rich educated counterparts who are still top of the distribution are the biggest ones that exist in our distribution.
Yes, we have one more question over here.
Thank you. Would you be able to discuss what you see as the politically feasible set of solutions, and perhaps who by position or actual group is going to drive the changes necessary? As in, we've talked a lot about the people who most need the help are the people that say, no, get out of my life, government, and they're voting for the types of people that are unwinding the changes they need. So realistically, and this is a near impossible question to answer actually, what can you see as actually a practical, feasible solution within the states for this huge problem?
It's a nearly impossible question to answer in the current climate, indeed. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a great deal of anger when people actually lose their health care and realize that America's not going to be great again and all these jobs aren't coming back. And how that anger is directed is also unclear. I mean, it could be that we get more division and people move more to the alt-right, as we call it, which would be really both frightening and incredibly counterproductive in terms of any kind of policy solution. It could be that basically there's a change in the political, by November 2018, that the Republicans lose the House and the Senate, and then you're going to have a bipartisan realism on more productive policy solutions. And there's a lot of language out there, but I think particularly having now been threatened with losing their health care, some of these groups may be a little wiser about what they're thinking and saying about kind of get the government out of my health care. But I honestly don't know. It's not a very intelligent way to end it, but it's just it's almost a crazy situation.
Okay, I think it's about time to draw this to an end and get some caffeine to people. That was a wonderful presentation. It strikes me when you look forward, if you look at the work of Bill Nordhaus and you look at some of the work we've been doing and others looking at the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on structural transformation of the global economy, these issues that you're talking about now become even vastly more important as we move forward. So understanding the work you're doing is going to have to make a big contribution to policy making, even though technically, politically infeasible today, it has to be addressed because of the societal changes that are coming down the track. And I guess the bottom line is Donald Trump is the answer. I really worry about what the question is. But thank you very much, Carol. That was fascinating, and I'm sure people will talk to you over the next couple of days. Carol will be here, I understand, for most of the time. So please go up and say hello and make Carol feel welcome.